Is this thing live? It looks like we're live. What's happening, everybody? I hope everybody's having a fantastic whatever day you're watching this. It is April 26th. Happy Hemi Day. 426 only comes once a year, and today is the day. Just so happens to land on a live show. So, happy Hemi Day to one and all. And in this show, what I wanted to do is have a little bit of an old school throwback Mopar chat. Wanted to talk a little bit about where all of the lore and all of the legends come from. Really, it's a lot more than that. There's so much more to that Gen 2 Hemi. Remember, there were Hemis before the Hemi, but realistically, it was the 426, and namely the 426 Street Hemi that got most of the attention, and for good reason. But there's a lot of hype and a lot of nostalgia that has always, I don't know, what's the best way to put it? It's always been kind of glued to the Hemi name. And the interesting thing is, as good as the race Hemi was, the street Hemi wasn't really all that impressive. I know this because I've dynoed them, I've driven the cars. And although they sound amazing, they look amazing underneath the hood. There's a lot to be desired when it came to that street Hemi, but you've got to remember a few things. You've got to take that engine in context, and you don't want to go down the wrong rabbit hole. I think that a lot of people get it a little bit twisted. They think that that engine made a lot more power than it did. And they forget that in 1966, when the Street Hemi was released into the world for public consumption, it was released in 1964 as a race-only option. Significantly different engine than the Street Hemi, although the Street Hemi could be upgraded to very similar performance specs as that race Hemi. It was never really there. Gary, thank you very much, man. I appreciate that. Hell yeah. Thank you, sir. Saying love my Hemi. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Let me check in with you guys real quick, and I'll get back into the monologue here. Person in check 6. Happy 426 day. Got the bald guy with the flex. I like it. Gary is in again. Thank you very much. DM is in. I like it. DM saying, I guess Mopar is coming out with a V10 and possibly 12 right now, but back to history. Exactly. We can talk about upcoming stuff too. The original one made 1 millions of horsepowers. Yes. Ryan is in too. Good seeing you, brother. All right, guys. So check this out. Back in 1964, Chrysler Corporation released the Race Hemi. And the interesting thing about this engine, it was roughly 12.5 to 1 compression ratio. It had a pair of Carter carburetors on it, if memory serves me correctly. There was a single 4-barrel variant of that engine also. There were a host of different applications for that engine. Drag racing, NASCAR would be the two primary drivers for that engine. And the funny thing, though, is it's an early performance engine. People forget that in 1964, let me start naming off the engines that did not exist, or that I'll start with this. Buick 455 Stage 1 didn't exist. None of the high winding small blocks, the 302, for example, from Chevrolet, or the 289 Hypo didn't exist yet. Remember that 289 Hypo would be released in 1964 and 1965 for Ford. The 427 side oiler from Ford didn't exist either. The L88 didn't exist. The L78 didn't exist from Chevrolet. You had a host of big blocks that did not exist when the Hemi was released. Everybody had to play catch up. Fun fact, the Mark III big block Chevrolet was a direct line of sight competitor to the Hemi with its canted valve architecture. A lot of people don't realize that mundane 454 that your granddad has in his pickup truck, That was originally designed to dethrone the mighty 426 Hemi. Go figure, right? But that also bled down into the 396 and the 427. I think you guys get the idea. The Hemi was the original bred for the street type of engine. Yes, you had the 409 before that from Chevrolet, and there were some other engines that were out, but they weren't as dedicated as it would end up being as the Hemi was. Those other engines also didn't. 273 two barrel person in chat too. Yes, 273 two barrel had a single exhaust that was about that big around. It's pretty funny. But yes, there were other engines that would come after the Hemi, but no other manufacturer was able to monetize and to market the way that Dodge did with that Hemi, because they were the first to the table with this thing. The Boss engines from Ford would come close with the Boss 351 and the Boss 429. By the way, Ford's Hemi, if you will, but they never really took off. They never really had that grasp that the Hemi had on the entire market. And a lot of that had to do with the types of cars that it was put in, primarily in B bodies initially. These were classy cars. These were Dodge styled vehicles. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to styling, it doesn't get, and it didn't get any better than Dodge. So you had a great looking car with an engine that had a race pedigree. Basically, the commercials would write themselves. Now, the Hemi, street Hemi, had its own set of issues, if you will. One of the issues that it had was a really good set of cylinder heads, but low compression. A lot of folks forget that it's not too hard to do the math on one of these engines and figure out they're not going to be the best street engine. What do I mean by that? Well, you got a set of cylinder heads that flow somewhere around 280 CFM. That's a lot, by the way. But back then it would have been a whole lot. And 280 CFM, 10.5 to 1 compression with a cylinder head that doesn't have a whole lot of port velocity, not until you start to rev it. And because of that, it was kind of lazy on the street. And if you ever get a chance to drive one of the original Gen 2 Hemi cars, you'll come away from the experience kind of going, man, it's a monster, provided that you have your foot buried in it. They don't really come alive until about 4,000 RPM. Below about 3,500 RPM, they're pretty lazy. And that's why all of the Max Wedge engines that came before them were such good street engines. They just didn't have the cylinder head flow capability that they were able to get out of the Hemi. And it's kind of a weird thing too, because the technology kind of leapfrogged the Max Wedge. The funny thing about the 413 and the 426 Max Wedge engines that evolved into the Hemi is that Dodge never put more R&D into the wedge head to get them to flow better. If that would have been the case, I think 1 or 2 more years of development in the Max Wedge, and you may have never even seen the Hemi, because the Max Wedge would have been outperforming it, which on the street and at the drag strip was not uncommon to see a Hemi car fall to a Max Wedge car, compression ratio for compression ratio, and weight for weight for the cars. So definitely something to keep in mind when we're talking about the Hemis. Let me catch back up with you guys. Orange Jeep is in. Ryan saying Mopar is just going to throw shit at the wall for the next 2 years to see if it sticks because of how bad they're doing. Well, we are going to get into that in just a second. Skids is in. Skid knows all about the 426. Happy Hemi Day. DM is in. Ryan's liking the Max Wedge. I'm a much bigger fan of the Max Wedge cars, guys. I love the mid-century, the early to mid-60s, that mid-century look, the Polaris, the Sport Furies with the Max Wedge. Such good stuff. Ryan saying, oh, did they have the 273 Commando? Yes. Yes, they did. In fact, that's a good running little engine. Don't forget, that would have been the engine in the Barracuda when it was released just, what, 6 weeks before the Mustang was. Ryan saying he misses the Belvedere. Belvedere is one of my all-time favorite cars. B-body, so good with a big block. Cannot beat that car. From a styling point of view, a Belvedere with the center console, oh man, that's such a pretty car. And that's another thing. Dodge Chrysler Corporation did such an amazing job with styling. I don't think that any other manufacturer could touch Dodge when it came to any of the B bodies, the E bodies, which would be the Challenger and the Cuda/Barracuda. Even the A body stuff, like the Darts, there were some really good looking cars. And what Dodge always did exceptionally well, interiors. It is so difficult to beat or even to meet the level of attention to detail that Dodge has, and still to this day, with their interiors. And if nothing else, let's also look at it from a more pragmatic point of view. We're talking about Happy Hemi Day and how well the Hemi was received from a marketing point of view, but wasn't all that well received in the actual marketplace. The main reason for that was just what we were talking about earlier. Very low port velocity until you got to about 4,700 RPM, where it really got efficient. And they were kind of dogged, and up north, anywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line, having a Hemi would have been a little bit of a problem during the winter. It was definitely not a cold weather engine. Again, low compression, low port velocity means it's going to be real persnickety in cold weather trying to get that thing to start. And so a lot of folks, man, the other thing too is a lot of people would say, it was a $800 option and it was so expensive. Guys, dollar for dollar, cars were so much cheaper then than they are now, meaning that they took far less of your hourly income to be able to afford the car. Average cost of a car back then would equate to around $35,000, maybe even $30,000 for a very nice, well-equipped B body, which today that would be practically double. So I think you get the idea. There was so it was the money for the Hemi was not the thing that kept people from buying a Hemi. It was the fact that if you wanted a big block, you could get a 440 car that felt stronger under all driving conditions. And they would even tell you that on the street, a 440 with a good tune-up would be more than enough to hand a Hemi its ass. It was only until the Hemi was allowed to stretch its legs. But by that time, I mean, you're already going well over 100, 104, 105 miles per hour. And yeah, how long are we going to be racing these for? I mean, you run out of gear ratio before you run out of engine with the 440. And so, and running the Hemi with the gear ratio that would actually make sense would be a nightmare on the highway. You'd be cruising along at 70 miles an hour at 3,500 RPM. It would just, it'd be very uncomfortable. So, but anyway, getting back to it. So the 426 in street Hemi form wasn't really the best street engine, but it was a good foundation. And the guys that would buy the car and immediately pull that engine and put 12.5-to-1 compression pistons in it, solid lifters, because remember the street Hemi had hydraulic lifters, go with a solid lifter setup, better valve springs, and a different camshaft, one that was more in line with the head flow capacity of that engine. Now we were talking about a car that, and by the way, go with a different intake manifold, go with the dual 4-barrel or a single 4-barrel setup, where that car would then actually make somewhere around 600 horsepower. That is what you were going for with that Hemi. But out of the box, gross horsepower, 425 out of the 426. That was optimistic. That was rated at a time, and they never went back and adjusted it. But keep in mind, when that engine was rated, that was with no fan, the high performance manifolds, no full exhaust system, and it was an optimized tune on an engine dyno in optimized conditions. And so with all of and optimized fuel too, by the way. And so with all of that working in its favor, it was rated at 425 horsepower. Some will say, well, if you put it on an engine dyno, you can get 450 out of it. Okay, if you say so. But I'll just put it to you like this. In 1971, which was the last year of the 426 Hemi, that's the year they started to rate these things as net horsepower as opposed to gross horsepower. And if you have ever seen the net horsepower of a 426 Hemi, it's a little bit sobering, although it's also kind of impressive. Anyway, the number is 350. So the 426 Hemi, when rated as a net horsepower figure, which means a fan on there, you've got the water pump being driven, you've got an alternator being driven, you have a full exhaust system and an air cleaner attached to it. When you factor all of that in, it put down 350 horsepower, which is not a lot by today's standard. And full stop. It's just not, right? But by the standard of the day, it was still very powerful. Easily 100 horsepower more powerful than a lot of the lower performance big blocks at the time. So is that a bad thing that it was rated at 350? I think it's a more realistic number out of that engine. But keep in mind that that engine really was a lot more it was a statement piece more than it was anything else. Let me check back in with you guys. Person in chat saying, smash that thumbs up or buy a Tesla or do both. Oh, Ryan's, I missed the Belvedere as well. Yeah, my Belvedere had a 273 two-barrel. That's a fun car. God, there was a 67 Barracuda for sale here not that long ago. By the way, that Dart is still for sale. I guess it's for sale. That car lot went out of business and that Dart's still sitting there. So I might be making a bid for that car here pretty soon. Not that I need another project. I kind of don't, but it wouldn't be bad to have a Dart in the lineup. The only thing with that though is that I would be really torn with doing a modern Hemi swap on it. And that brings me to something else. You know, we're talking about the 426 Hemi, and it is Hemi Day. A lot of folks would say that, you know, the legend of Dodge died with that Gen 2 Hemi, and that the 392 and the 5.7 liter that we had up until somewhat recently aren't real Hemis. And to that, I always didn't quite understand the logic behind that, because they are real Hemis, or at least shotgun head cylinder heads, which is to say that the intake valve and the exhaust valve are inner is the intake, outer is the exhaust valve. But with them being shotgun heads, I mean, this would be what that Hemi would have eventually evolved into anyway. Lots of quench area, still a shotgun head. You could still call it a Hemi. So I never really agreed with that. That's kind of a weird trait that Mopar guys have had, is they have a nasty habit of a lot of bickering when it comes to their beloved engines. And I never did agree with the modern Hemis not being Hemis. But with that being said, the modern stuff is so much more powerful than what the older Hemis would have been by today's standard. That, you know, doing like a 5.7 swap on that car, or a 392 swap with a modern transmission to go along with it so that it's not buzzing at ridiculous RPM, that would be pretty cool. But that's the only change that I would make. I wouldn't, visually, it would just look like a Dart, but you'd pop the hood and see, you know, one of the modern Gen 3 Hemis underneath the hood. DM saying 65, 67 Chevelle and Camaro, pretty cars. There's a 66 Chevelle for sale in town. It's the Laguna Blue. It's a really pretty car. Ryan saying to step down to 66 Formula S Barracuda Fastback when the 273, that thing was a blast. I believe, though, it was the A bodies before the CUDA, which was the E body. Yeah, it was the A bodies that were before. Yeah, the Darts were out well before the E bodies. The E bodies were 1970 and later, I believe. skid saying Chrysler's Hemi engines derived from the engines in military aircraft. The cylinder head design did. So the engineers that developed the Hemi engine for Dodge back in 1953 for the Gen 1 Hemi, those guys were all part of the Chrysler Corporation that was helping to develop the Pratt & Whitney Wasp series of engines. But back then, all aviation engines that were two-valve were all hemispherical head. Every single one of them were. And the reason for that is because a Hemi head, like why a Hemi? So let's get into that part of it now too. Why the Hemi head and why is it so good? Well, every cylinder head design has its benefits and has its compromises. And where a hemispherical head has its benefits, and keep in mind, this isn't just going back to World War II era engines. Guys, this goes back to Hall-Scott engines that were designed in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, all of which had Hemi heads. In fact, it's the original cylinder head design. Believe it or not, the original, what would have been a flow dynamic engineer, they didn't think that there was another way to do it. They just all defaulted to the 45 or the 90-degree hemispherical head layout. And by the way, that was when cylinder heads didn't even exist. The cylinder, how do I illustrate this? The cylinder, like if you can imagine, okay, hang on. Okay, so cylinder heads are kind of funny in that they were a much later development. This would have been your cylinder. And in the cylinder machined, you would have where the cylinder would be going up and down this way. The cylinder itself would have machined into it valve seats. And so the head was actually a part of the actual assembly itself. And the reason why, anyway, getting back, I'm getting a little bit off topic. The reason why hemispherical head and why the 90-degree valve angle was because of volumetric efficiency. These were engines that had 5-inch bores, but 7-inch strokes, and not very much in terms of compression ratio. And the idea was to make a cylinder head, if you will, a valve arrangement and a mechanism to get air into the cylinder, as much air as you could possibly get, as efficiently as possible. And it was really tuned more for a specific RPM range, typically between, depending on the engine, you might have it. Let's say you have an engine that spins to 3,000 RPM. It was designed to be ultra efficient between 2,500 and 3,000 RPM. And so for the either naturally aspirated engines or the supercharged engines, you needed something that was going to be the least restrictive as far as getting air into a vacuumed container, which would be your cylinder. Hemispherical head does that the best. By the way, it wasn't long. Keep in mind, the radial engines from World War II, those are all two-valve engines. All of the engines that would be a water-cooled, doesn't matter who made it, would have all been 4-valve per cylinder, and those were called pentaroof as opposed to Hemi, just because of how it's shaped. They all look like little roof on a house. Anyway, you get the idea. So the idea with the Hemi engine was the same thing. They were going to try to focus cylinder head flow and cylinder filling at high RPM. That's why they use that cylinder head design. Now, what's the drawback? What's the compromise on a Hemi head? I mean, so far it sounds like it's great. It flows the most, right? Does all that. Well, here's the problem with the hemispherical cylinder head. And this is where guys started running into issues on the street and in racing. And if you are trying to run this engine naturally aspirated, there's two things that happen. One, if you have that hemispherical cylinder design or cylinder head design, it means that you're going to have potentially a lot of room where there's no compression happening. It's a lot of dead space, if you will. And so to make up for that, so you have compression ratio, you have to have a heavier piston with more material on top to give you more squish, if you will, from the top of the piston to the bottom of the cylinder head. That creates weight. That also creates more turbulence inside the cylinder when it comes to the actual flame front, which means the flame front takes longer to propagate, and it can propagate ununiformly, which can create issues with efficiency in terms of making power. Again, narrowly speaking, it will make good power, but over a broad power band, sometimes it would be a bit less consistent. Although not still high performance, it would still be less consistent than its wedge-headed cousins. But that's the big thing. Now, if you add supercharging to the mix, again, remember that the Hemi head configuration is incredibly efficient at volumetric efficiency, just not thermodynamic. Well, don't worry anymore about that. If you've got a compressor feeding that cylinder head, your air is now much more compressed, so your effective compression ratio goes way high, and so you fire off that charge, so to speak, in the cylinder. It propagates very quickly, and that's why Hemi heads are way better with boost than they are, in many cases, naturally aspirated, depending on the configuration. Now, what about a wedge head? Well, let me put something else to rest too. How the valves are oriented in the combustion chamber is meaningless. It's how they are splayed and how they are how direct the airflow is into the cylinder. That's why that hemispherical head, the way that it's shaped, works. It's just a direct line of sight to the atmosphere, if you will. Some guys would say, well, air comes in and it goes right out. There's a whole cycle in between that. The engine doesn't care how that part of getting air into and out of a cylinder works. Pressure variances and differentials, whether the valves are right next to each other or stacked on top of each other or canted and twisted, there's other ways that doesn't matter. I'll just leave it at that. It's a wives' tale that flows, and people just look at it and they think, oh, the air goes in and it comes right out. Well, it goes right in, it gets compressed, fired, and then on the downstroke, it's blowing out. So no, it doesn't really help that much in terms of flow. If that were the case, LS7 heads would not make the power that they make when you compare them to a Hemi head. But anyway, getting back to it. The wedge head, on the other hand, is not as efficient as the Hemi from a volumetric efficiency standpoint because of how it's shaped, because of the way that the ports have to be shaped on a wedge head with the valves right next to each other. That can be a limiting factor in terms of having a large volume of air running through your cylinder head, but it does aid in velocity, which means that mid-flow numbers, in other words, call it lift numbers with the cam, or mid RPM, engine RPM flow numbers are very high with very high velocity, very integrated mixture. And in that respect, very good quench when the piston comes up to the bottom of the cylinder head. There's no wasted space. There's no extra volume being created, and the piston is lighter. So in that respect, it is more thermodynamically efficient, meaning you get more power per square, whatever your square millimeter of compressed area is, but you just miss out on the actual flow characteristics that the Hemi head makes. So what's the trick? What's the real balance? The real balance is to put a set of wedge heads together that flows as much, or at least has the same flow characteristics of a Hemi head. But at the end of the day, that's going to be impossible. Here's the kind of party trick that the Hemi has. Whenever you have a valve open, the fact that the valve is even there is a flow restriction. And there is only so big of a valve that you can put in a wedge head before the cylinder wall itself becomes a shrouding effect. The angle of the valve, the air coming in, as the piston is coming down, the air coming in will literally hit the side of the cylinder, and that becomes the restriction. Hemi head, the valves are up and out of the way of all of the things that would be a shrouding effect. And so the Hemi engine, where it does have a bit of a party trick, is because those valves are kicked up and kicked out, or kicked up in the center and kicked out a little bit. What that allows is when that intake valve opens, all of the combustion chamber is open for cylinder or for airflow into the cylinder. Conversely, on the exhaust side, which by some estimations is even more important than the intake side, and you open the exhaust valve, as that piston is coming down, you have pressure decay. You start to crack open. You start to crack open that that exhaust valve, and the pressure starts to drive the exhaust out. There's nothing shrouding it, and there's nothing that's going to create an eddy for that exhaust to come out of that cylinder. So that is the big party trick of a Hemi engine. And if you have a low compression, a flatter top piston, lots of boost, and a lot of spark, you can make that work exceptionally well. And top fuel dragsters make really good use of those properties. Let's see. Let me get back to you guys. Ryan saying, yep, DeSoto or Imperial. DeSoto had the original Hemis. So the Gen 1 Hemi, here's the funny thing. The Gen 1s, they were called Fire Dome, by the way. And they weren't super powerful by today's standards, but by the standard of the day, whether you're talking about the three, by the way, you ever wonder where the new displacement, the 345 and the 392 come from? Those are Gen 1 displacements. The 345 Hemi and the 392 Hemi were DeSoto primarily. You did see them on the Chrysler side, but yeah, the DeSoto Fire Dome engines were, again, although not ultra powerful by today's standard, were about 20% more powerful than anything from any other manufacturer at the time. So something to consider. I mean, those were true hot rods, the Chrysler letter cars from back then, all very powerful engines. Now, along the same lines, you also had the Super Commando engines and the Golden Commando engines that Dodge would have. In fact, Christine, if you're familiar with that movie, the 58 Plymouth Belvedere, mind you, which in the book, it was a 4-door. For the movie, it was a 2-door, but that car was shown to have the 350 cubic inch big block. The original high performance big block would have been released in 1957 or 1958 with that 350 cubic inch wedge head. That's what would turn into the 383 or 361, then 383. And then the raised block, the RB cars, would be what you would see for the 440. So kind of some cool stuff there too. Ryan saying, I think people don't hear cam chop and think it's weaker. A lot of people equate cam chop to power. And it's not the case all the time. Oh, it's definitely not the case. Here's the funny thing about that. So when I was putting this is kind of funny, like some behind the scenes stuff. When I was helping to put the cam profiles together and the cam program together for Pikes, it was funny because we never took the sound of that cam into consideration, not even once. It was all looking at the math, looking at valve opening and closing events, and what was going to work best, what was going to be the best for the street, overall performance gain, going with as small of a cam as you can go and still maintain drivability, throttle response, tap in torque, everything that would come from just an overall power improvement. That's what we did. And it was funny because the very first one, my cam, the CDO1, had no chop to it at all. It just kind of had a little bit of a lope at startup when the mixture was rich. And then once everything warmed up, it's like you kind of could hear something, but there really wasn't a whole lot going on with that cam. But it made, it would be good with, full exhaust and a tune and everything. You'd pick up about 10% with that cam. So not too bad. Now you can always go bigger, of course, but I think the main idea here is that there were always opportunities to put bigger, more chop. In other words, tighten up the LSA. There was always that option, but we were only looking for performance. And that cam in a few cars went out and hurt a lot of people's feelings because they had no idea there was a cam in the car that they were racing. Carzilla's checking in. Ryan said, we need Wings Wednesday chat. I may put something like that together. So Charger's asking about the A925 project, which was, so Dodge had a 32 valve overhead cam 426 that would have been the successor to the street Hemi, to the race Hemi. And Dodge was not alone in this. Buick had a 4 valve that was practically ready for production. And I want to say that Chevrolet was well on their way to developing one as well. But the most famous is the A925 project. The problem with that is to get it to actually pass an emissions, get an executive order, that would be tough. But they should have gone through with that, or they should have gone through with the ball stud Hemi. And what that is that the ball and stud Hemi, which there was one made. In fact, it was here in Texas for a long time. The ball and stud Hemi would have been, in essence, Mopar's Mark III Chevy big block. That's kind of how that architecture was. It was a twisted Hemi, and instead of using shaft mount rockers, it used ball and stud for the rockers. Well, actually, yeah, Charger's saying Chrysler respect the A925 to rev above 10K. That would have been in race trim. And it may have handled it, but it wouldn't have lived up there. The metallurgy just wasn't there quite yet for it to live at that level of RPM for any real length of time. But they would have been parking that thing at about 8,500 RPM and just letting it live out there. And Ford did have the single overhead cam 427. They also had a dual overhead cam engine that they campaigned in road racing. And it's pretty funny. If you ever see pictures of it, it had the intakes were literally like right in the middle of the cylinder head, and the exhaust was where the intake manifold would normally be. They had that variant, and they also had a more traditional variant. So when you get a chance, check that one out. But yeah, the Ford did have the camera, and the funny thing about the camera is that was a real bummer of an engine because it just never was able to be street vetted. And for a lot of reasons. I mean, at that time, that would have been a very expensive engine to produce. And, but man, could you imagine that engine instead of, well, I mean, the Boss 429 was a legit powerhouse too. Very underrated, by the way. But yeah, awesome engines back then. Here's the thing. People think that these modern engines today have somehow or another a monopoly on technology, cylinder head flow, and outright horsepower numbers. Guys, one of the things you've got to remember is back then, metallurgy just wasn't the way that it is today. And that's a big thing. Coatings weren't the same. But you know when one of the biggest inhibitors was actually lubrication technology. And this is something that gets a little bit lost in the sauce, guys, but you can attribute, I would say somewhere between 10 and 15% of the amount of power that the car you're driving today makes is available because of the advanced polymer technology that is in the lubricants that keep that engine alive. So that, along with the metallurgy, and obviously modern fuel injection and the way that timing can be manipulated, there's so much to it that add to a broad power band. But when it comes to just outright making power, about the only things that you're limited by realistically back then was lubrication, because the fuel quality was certainly there. But the other side was just the metallurgy and the fact, you got to remember, these were big engines. And unfortunately, RPM and RPM sustainability and all of that, it doesn't scale up the way that you would think. Like if you've got a motorcycle engine can spin to 8,500 RPM, and that's completely normal. And in fact, let's say it's only efficient from like 5,000 RPM to 8,500 RPM. If you were to scale that engine up and just make it bigger, the problem is that it doesn't work like that, because now the webbing would have to be much thicker. The pistons would have to be much more robust, because as size doubles, mass goes up by a full 8. So if something weighs, if something weighs 1 pound and you double the size of it dimensionally, it will go from weighing 1 pound to 8 pounds. And so you can see how, modern advanced metallurgy allowing these engines to live at higher RPM and deal with conditions that would wreck those older, bigger engines back in the day. Now we have the metallurgy, though, to make it work. We have the electronics. We can manage the fuel so much better. And realistically, it's just a matter of how do you make it clean in the area that they test your engine. But I don't see any reason why you couldn't make it work. Obviously, you'd be giving up some levels of efficiency, but we ain't worried about efficiency here. We're worried about outright power. Ryan's asking, why didn't they pursue the poly heads more? The reason why they didn't pursue the poly heads more was because the LA engine family, which would have been realistically 270, 318, 340, 360, those were much less expensive to make. They are very easy to pour, in other words. They're easier all the way around when it comes to machining. And that's the reason why. And they would meet the engineer's power requirements, and they did it at a much lower cost. So let's say I'm the engineer, I'm the MDE on a powertrain team, and I need to come up with an engine, and it needs to make 300 horsepower, 350 pound-feet of torque, and it needs to run in a world around pump gas, right? So it's got to be in a pump gas friendly compression ratio. I can achieve all of those goals with a wedge head. I don't have to have poly. I don't have to have canted. I don't have to have any of that. Plus, with the wedge head, I'm going to have much higher. Remember, we're talking about those mid-level, that mid RPM, mid camshaft flow numbers. I'm going to have very high velocity, which means I'm going to have a lot of throttle response. I'm going to have a lot of tip-in throttle response and a lot of tip-in torque. And that's where that comes from the most. So the poly heads were good, and they would have been really good at making power across a broad RPM range. It's just that when you start to look at, and they're also heavier. So that's something else to consider as well. The wedge heads typically have less material in general that they're using. And so because of that, because they're just smaller, they're not as wide. Poly heads are a little bit wider. And then, have you ever seen like a set of GM big block heads? They look like big block heads, right? It's not just because they're on a bigger engine. They're wider to accommodate a canted valve arrangement. Whereas if you see a set of like Buick heads or something like that, they're just not as big. In fact, they look like a little bit bigger small block heads. That's where a lot of that is coming from. So, but to answer the question, that's why. It was just easier to do it with a wedge head. It meets all of the engineering requirements. It meets all of the bean counter requirements. From a casting point of view, they're very easy to cast, which is the word I was trying to come up with earlier. So you can make a ton of them. And because of the configuration of the head, they're very easy to machine from a rough casting to a finished casting. So lots of reasons why. But yeah, guys, so just kind of a fun trip down memory lane with the Hemis. I just wanted to talk about it a little bit today. Perfect timing. It is Happy Hemi Day. This is the 59th year of that Hemi, the street Hemi, and the 61st year of the actual race Hemi. Ryan said, yeah, but they're cooler. And oh yeah, they're a whole lot cooler. The poly head stuff was always really cool. And it's a real shame that they didn't stick with that type of an architecture, because I think that had they stuck with that architecture, I think the complexion of Dodge would have been quite a bit different later on. But yeah, I just want to take a quick trip down memory lane, guys. We're about to wrap it up here pretty soon on the show. But, you know, it's fun to think about this because of how cool the cars Dodge used to make were. You know, from a styling point of view, that you couldn't touch any of the Mopar products from just a sheer look. You know, I always, when I was a kid, I was never really worried about which one was faster, which one was, because they were all fast, right? I always liked the Dodge because it looked like a really sharp suit that you put on. Like, take a look at a Sport Fury, take a look at a 68 Charger, take a look at the the Belvederes, take a look at those cars. Take a look at the letter series cars, the 300 cars. Those cars look like a very good fitting suit, stylish, just that it factor that the Dodges always seem to have that the others didn't really quite ever get to. You know, I mean, yes, some of the Cadillacs look good, and some of the Lincolns did as well. Cool looking T-Birds, albeit a little bit quirky. I'm a big fan of the bird, but you always got the hint when you were looking at a Dodge, it was just a crisper, tauter look. And that's what Dodge used to make. And it didn't have to be the fastest. They were all very fast. And it's a shame that we don't see that today. You know, again, it's good to look at, you know, where we've come from. But unfortunately, we don't have a horizon to look over just yet, guys. Dodge as a brand is, and I've said it like this before, it's the turd that is circling the bowl right now. That lever's already been pushed and the flush is underway. And I've got to say that it's a shame that Dodge can't look back to that part of their past. I mean, over the last 15 years, Dodge has made a very strong business model out of trading on their past, trading on nostalgia. That is the commodity that they have been selling. And if they could just bring that back, you know, people are talking about, well, you know, could we have a V10 or the Viper come back and all this other stuff? And it's like, dude, no, the Viper doesn't need to come back unless the Viper is running a completely different engine configuration and has an automatic transmission and has levels to it. They need to copy the Corvette model branding model, which is to say you've got an entry-level car, an upgrade, an upgrade, and an upgrade. But you've got to have levels to that game. That's why the Viper failed before. That's why it will fail again if they don't get it right. Of the other cars, you know, it's, you know, what do you say? You know, there's not going to be anything new to talk about for a while. And the Charger that we have now, the Daytona, whatever, that car is I hate to say it, but it's stillborn. And that's one of the saddest things you can say about any Dodge product right now. Stuart saying 426 crate or 392 stroke to 426. It depends on who's doing the engine build. If you're getting like an Arrington 426, they're all really good. Ryan saying he wants the Cold War era cars. Yes, absolutely. Give me a Stealth or give me something like the Wraith. Yeah, something cool, something out there, something different. So you're saying a DOHC 426 would be great. Let me tell you, the only problem with a dual overhead cam 426 is how tall that thing would be. Packaging that engine would be a nightmare. Skid saying, yeah, the Cuda doesn't even need to come back. Get a coupe sedan with some styling cues from the 80s or 90s. Throw in a dual overhead cam 5-ish liter Magnum Coyote, and it's done. This is the funny thing. I feel like this is one of those Mandela effects because I know, I remember this vividly talking about a 5.5-ish liter dual overhead cam V8 that Dodge was planning on putting. It was going to be the replacement for the 5.7 and the 6.4. And it was, in essence, going to be what was going to be the engine that powered all of the Challengers and Chargers once the LX platform was discontinued. And that discontinuation was supposed to be 2019. The OG Demon was supposed to be the swan song for that platform. And then they re-signed with Brampton and the new engine fluttered away like a butterfly. And I swear to you, I know that I remember the rumors. I remember Steve Mignante talking about it. But it's like I can't find anything on the web anymore that points a finger back to it. So I don't know, man. Maybe it was a fever dream or something, but I do remember it very clearly. DM saying the Conquest. Yes. Y'all know I got such a soft spot in my heart for those cars. AKA the Mitsubishi Starion or a Shadow Coupe. Yeah, any of those would be sweet. We need stuff like that. We need cars like that. Look, talk about a missed opportunity. The Hurricane 6, believe it or not, would have a lot of Cold War kids salivating if they would bring back the Conquest with the Hurricane 6, make it rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, whatever. Call it the Talon, make it all-wheel drive, whatever you want to do. But there are so many people now of a certain age that would welcome the 4-cylinder turbo, the 6-cylinder turbo, DSM type car. That's the Diamond Star Motors, which would have been the Conquest, the Stealth, the Talon, and all of their Mitsubishi counterparts. Something styled along those lines, but with that type of an engine. Oh my freaking God. Like, here, just take all my monies. You can, please and thank you. Just keys, please. That's the market that they're missing. And again, you know, it's fun to bring up the memba berries when it comes to the Hemi and when it comes to everything that the Hemi would have meant for a lot of folks. But guys, that engine that is where all the marketing hype still stems from is now 60 years old. Either you can pick 1964 or 1966. Let's meet in the middle in 2025 and call that a 60-year-old marketing campaign. Guys, it's time to do something cool. It's time to do something different. Bring back the DSM cars. Bring back a reason to get excited about the new H6 engine. Don't try to force feed us the new Charger with its grandpa styling and B-level fit and finish. Guys, that's what I would want out of Mopar right now. And say what you will, but there's a reality that comes with time, and that is what's old becomes new again. But when the new again becomes old, it's time to move on. That nostalgia, the generations that can appreciate it have come and gone. We need to be catering to the new nostalgia and creating a new car for the young folks to remember fondly. And guys, with that, I got to start wrapping it up. Let me catch up with you guys real quick. DM saying a revised Talon would be sick for sure. This kid's saying the H6 been shoved into a car the size of the BMW 5 Series. Yeah, it needs to be a lot smaller. Ryan's checking in with skids for sure. And DM saying, my dad can't even drive anymore. Dodge is pandering to the wrong target market. Couldn't agree more, brother. Absolutely. Hit the nail on the head with that. Guys, I've got to wrap it up. Listen, again, happy 426. Happy Hemi Day. Get out there and do something cool for somebody. Chances are they need it way more than you know. And person in chat 6 and Gary Fuller, thank you all so much for the support. It means a ton to me. Keeps this channel rolling. And with that, guys, I've got to wrap it up. Take care. We'll catch you on the next one.